A few years back, I found myself dog-sitting for my sister and had 2 weeks of entertaining myself to do without all the amenities you would normally find in my hovel. Pretty much my options were watch Netflix or watch Netflix. Now this was the days when Netflix was really the only option for streaming services. Sure, Hulu was around, but it pretty much just had the same selection as Netflix, only more restricted, and all the studio-specific streaming services weren't really a thing yet. So at the time, Netflix still constituted a one-stop shop for all your science fiction binging needs. Now, I had already watched pretty much all of the Star Treks a dozen times over and had decided that Stargate just wasn't all that interesting to me, so I was on the hunt for something new. Enter Dark Matter, a series that was showcased ad nauseum by Netflix due to my browsing history, and lacking better options, I decided to finally check it out. The next 2 weeks of dog sitting went by in a flash as I enjoyed the entire series. Enjoyed right up until the final cliffhanger episode, that is, when it became painfully obvious that this series, much like Firefly before it, had been unceremoniously cancelled. Now there are many interesting parallels between Firefly and Dark Matter. Both were fairly low budget for their times, both featured an ensemble cast traveling on a small hero ship. The cast was made up of somewhat experienced actors that were still obscure enough that they wouldn't have been household names yet. Both were cancelled before all loose ends in the story could be tied up, and neither really found an appreciative audience until after the series had already been cancelled. In all fairness though, it could be argued that Dark Matter never found its audience. As it stands here in 2024, it's been dropped by virtually every streaming service out there and can only be viewed by the CW's free, probably for good reason, platform. These similarities sometimes lead to an oversimplification in the sci-fi community that Dark Matter is just Canada's attempt at making a Firefly of their own, and succeeding just a little too well. But is it fair to call Dark Matter a Firefly clone? I personally take the position that Dark Matter is something else entirely. For this analysis, I will try to avoid serious spoilers, and keep any major plot points to something you would learn in the first episode, just in case you haven't watched it. Oh, who am I kidding? You probably never heard of it before 3 minutes ago anyway. There might be some minor spoilers to an episode or two of Firefly, but seriously, it's been 22 years. If you haven't seen it by now, it's your own damn fault. Dark Matter loses points for originality almost instantly as we're introduced to the crew, who are all suffering from amnesia. By 2015, when this series first aired, this trope had been beat to death in practically every genre of every form of fiction known to man, but it didn't stop Dark Matter. The entire crew of our mysterious home ship awake from stasis, one after another, with no memories of who they are and how they came to be on this ship. The ship is heavily damaged, but has an automatic repair feature, which is pretty cool and not something we normally see in sci-fi, at least not on anything larger than an infantry fighting vehicle. Looking at you, Mass Effect, no matter what people say, the Mako is awesome. You be you. Anyway, back to Dark Matter. The crew does seem to still possess deeply ingrained skills like piloting, martial arts, or technical maintenance and repair. Pending the reveal of their true identities, the crew chooses to call each other by the order in which they awoke from stasis. One is the team do-gooder. He's compassionate, sensitive, almost childishly naive in most situations, and always gets beat up. Two is the natural leader. She takes charge, prioritizes, and triages situations effectively, and her first act after waking up from stasis is beating up one. A little too on the nose. Anyway, three is the typical rogue looking out for himself. He likes guns, he packs guns, he points guns, and he doesn't get along with one. Are you picking up a pattern yet? Four is the silent, introspective type. He's pragmatic and ruthless when he needs to be, but usually just goes with whatever the majority of the crew want. Five appears to be the odd one out. While everyone else dresses one step above goth and are lacking many of the social graces, Five wears bright, esoteric clothing, has brightly dyed hair, and is friendly to everyone else on the ship, who tend to either discount her due to her apparent youth or assume protective parental attitudes that she doesn't always appreciate. She's the resident tech/infiltrator type. Finally, Six is sort of a complement to One. He tends to be led more by his conscience than the rest, but unlike One, is able to assert himself enough that he doesn't get tread on by the rest of the crew and serves as their shuttle pilot. This brief introduction tends to showcase just how derivative this series is. There's a person like One in almost every Grady series out there, someone who just doesn't understand how grave their circumstances are, or doesn't want to understand. Two is basically just Malcolm Reynolds with boobs, and fun fact, Melissa O'Neill actually went on to star alongside her Firefly counterpart in The Rookie. Three is Jane, without boobs. Four is basically Shepard Book minus 30 years, or possibly Teal from Stargate. Five is basically Wesley Crusher in every way except I don't want to punch her in the face every time she's on screen.
But shut up, Wesley.
And Six is pretty much here just because we need someone to be nice to Five and fly the shuttle. The ship is also equipped with an android named, wait wait for it, android, who suspiciously like Data from Star Trek is superior to humans in almost every way but can't feel emotions, although she wants to, and is only treated like a person by her own crew. She's mostly here to offer comedic relief and excels at it, by the way, and offers technical exposition every time the plot demands technobabble. If this was all there was to know about the crew and the story, we could easily disregard dark matter as a poorly planned derivative mess simply looking to cash in on the newfound resurgence of sci-fi in the mid-2010s, with the very unsuccessful but very hyped release of Star Trek Renegades and release of the first film in the dumpster fire that is the Disney Star Wars trilogy. But that's not really a fair critique here. Science fiction as we know it today is a genre that is now over a century old. Truly original ideas that can be applied here are extremely difficult to find. There's a reason there really hasn't been an original and well-performing science fiction franchise since the 80s. After you subtract the Star Wars, the Star Treks, the Stargates, the Battle Stars, the Battle Techs, the Warhammers, the Doctor Who's, and the Fireflies, which even in its time has been mocked as derivative, what's left that hasn't already been done? Pretty much the best you can hope for these days is to take inspiration from other franchises that beat you to the punch by 50 years and try your best to add enough nuance and variety that it sufficiently deviated from its inspirations as to become unrelated. Derivation in this day and age is to be expected, and it's pretty much just a buzzword people throw around whenever they want to voice their distaste for something. But dark matter is far more than elements derived from existing sources, interlaced with an amnesia subplot. It's a new exploration of the nature versus nurture debate over free will versus predetermination. Emancipated from the traumas of their past, the crew are free to sort of revert to a personality baseline. Even after they learn their true identities, the entire crew choose to continue going by their numbers rather than their names, as they are hunted across the galaxy by criminals or corrupt corporations they've wronged in the past, or by well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective governments looking to bring them to justice, whether they were falsely accused or not. Each member of the crew must make decisions consciously or otherwise whether they want to become the monsters they are reputed to be. Throughout the series, each member of the crew is slowly revealed to us a tiny shred at a time, showing the more selfish among the crew to have once experienced tenderness and exhibited selfless attitudes that they've now lost, or the more distrustful to have suffered deep betrayal in the past. An interesting progression that we see is that the series starts from day one as a born-to family. By necessity, the crew have to work together to survive, and they stay together out of absolute need, bound together by a common home and by shared experience, or lack thereof, since none of them remember anything. They've been together effectively their entire lives, so in this case, they very much are a born-to family in a non-traditional sense. But as they slowly learn their identities, their pasts, and are confronted with the reasons that led them here, they all eventually have to make a decision of whether or not to remain members of the crew, becoming a found family. It's actually pretty rare that a series can explore both interpersonal dynamics using a single plot instead of characters, and I honestly can't think of any other examples, at least nothing that's executed this well. The one member who experiences the most change is Five, who slowly earns the respect of the rest of the crew over time, moving from a child they refuse to let participate because they don't want her to become a criminal, as many of them apparently were before their amnesia, to becoming a ruthless and indispensable member of the team, even willing to take lethal action if it means protecting her crew. A close second is the android, who is by far the most endearing member of the crew. She starts off pretty much like every other sci-fi techno Pinocchio, speaking very monotonously. Is that a word? Screw it, it is now. Very matter-of-factly, very ignorant of just how funny most of her responses actually are when taken out of context, which they are a lot. She's very quickly shown to exhibit emotions which she seems to be unaware of and adamant that don't exist. But over time, as she slowly grows to accept them, has to balance her slowly growing humanity against functional and logical instability, as it is revealed her emotions are the result of programming errors which are growing worse over time. She also obtains an illegal modification that imbues her with almost indistinguishable mannerisms and emotions as people, which when in use by far makes her the most fun character on the show, but she can't use it all the time because it amplifies her capacity to make flawed decisions. Now, if you're a diehard Trekkie, you'll recognize this as a pretty one-for-one theft of the emotion chip upgrade that Data receives in Star Trek. However, Data experiencing emotions was super cringe in most cases and created tonal whiplash anytime it was woven into the plot. Android's playfulness and newfound ability to approach her crewmates as an equal is so heartwarming and made all the more frustrating when it's determined that she has to make a conscious decision to forego it in order to better guarantee her friend's safety. Basically, she had finally found her humanity and then willingly sacrificed it to protect those she cares about the most. Dark Matter may have stolen the idea from Star Trek, but Zoe Palmer blew Brent Spiner's performance away.
I hate this! It is revolting!
Fight me. Unfortunately, not every crew member gets equal screen time. Although it's an ensemble cast, the story tends to shift focus for extended periods of time. There are the series favorites, the ones that the crew would fall apart without, 2, 5, and the android. And before you start huffing about Mary Sue's, chill out, this isn't a Star Wars analysis, okay? Anyway, the rest of the crew, 1, 3, 4, and 6, don't really get equal attention. Sometimes there's valid plot reasons why they disappear for a couple episodes at a time. But despite each being interesting characters in their own right, many times they take extended and sometimes permanent backseats to become almost background characters. Now this is hardly unique in sci-fi, especially for shows that run multiple seasons. Will Wheaton eventually left Star Trek The Next Generation and was rarely seen again until he shows up as a villain in Dark Matter. Okay, Trekkies, that was a joke. Moving on. Dr. Crusher disappeared for an entire season of The Next Generation. Tess eventually left the crew of the USS Voyager and had to be replaced with a Data of their own, with boobs. Even in short-lived series like Firefly, Wash may as well have not even been on board for several episodes, a sentiment that Joss Whedon apparently agreed with. Too soon? It will always be too soon, Gray. Now, Dark Matter definitely has its narrative high points. It carries with it a level of grandeur, of high-stakes missions usually followed by far-reaching and devastating consequences, but the storytelling structure of the series unfortunately contributed to its own downfall in the end. The typical structure of a Dark Matter episode is to quickly deal with an issue that has arisen as a result of past events, followed by having to take calculated risks to mitigate that issue for good, complete the mission, prepare for closure, only to end the episode with some high-stakes cliffhanger, leading to the next episode having an issue that requires immediate remediation and leading to the same storytelling loop over and over again. This slow burn structure works so long as there's always another episode that comes after it that in some way addresses the events of the last, but it's mentally taxing to constantly watch as our crew rises again and again only to be beaten down in turn. It creates a narrative in which tension never really eases off. We don't get a grand resolution at the end of any of the 3 seasons, we just get even more dire cliffhangers. This was okay in seasons 1 and 2 because we got another season after that to help explore and try and settle those events. But the cliffhanger that ultimately ended the series doesn't get a resolution. It never will. The series is dead. This is really what separates Firefly from Dark Matter at their cores. Throughout Firefly's 14-episode run, it actually left very little unresolved. I've been trying to come up with video ideas to fill in the gaps that Firefly left after it was canceled halfway through its first season, and there's just not a lot there. This is simply because every episode of Firefly told a self-contained story. Even if there were threads of a larger overarching story arc, the chapters themselves had a beginning, a middle, and a resolution. Take the Firefly episode Shindig, for example, and yes, I'm spoiling this because it's not Dark Matter and it's 22 years old. Shindig starts as an unforeseen consequence of the fully resolved story that occurred in the pilot episode. The team undertakes a mission, Mal does Mal things, and the mission is a success, and now they have cargo to transport. It's all tied up in a neat little bow. The following episode, Safe, starts off immediately afterward, based on the delivery of said cargo. Pretty much every episode of Firefly follows this most basic tenet of storytelling. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But now imagine that we didn't start the episode Shindig with Serenity landing on Persephone, but instead the last episode ended with Mal being held at gunpoint by the unknown thug pointing a 600-year-old MP-38 submachine gun at him. Shindig starts with Mal trying to find his way out of the situation, but then Badger reveals himself and we start the mission. Then we get the job, deliver the cargo, and just as everything is going well, the episode ends with Book getting shot when the job goes south. This is basically how Dark Matter tells its story. All of the events have clear initiations, executions, and resolutions, but they are not self-contained within a single episode's framework. Each episode is completely dependent on the one that came before, and we rarely, if ever, get a resolution to the current episode without watching the next. For one thing, this creates a major problem for anyone trying to watch who may have missed an episode or two. It's also why Firefly successfully told 15 stories when the only time afforded to it was 14 episodes in a standalone movie, but Dark Dark Matter, when given 38 episodes, the same length as Firefly's, couldn't even successfully convey a single story. It was a tale that was 39 episodes in the making, but even when given 1,700 minutes of screen time, give or take, simply didn't measure up. Not due to a lack of substance, but due to poor structure and inability to break from an established convention that stood no chance whatsoever of offering closure unless the writers knew that a certain episode would be their last, which doesn't really happen when a series is cancelled without notice. I think this is what ultimately led Firefly to become such a cult classic and Dark Matter to fade into obscurity. At the end of the day, Firefly is complete. A lot of people take issue with the fact that Objects in Space was the last episode in this series because it didn't answer the overarching questions of what happened to River, who were the men in blue gloves, things like that. But ultimately, we were left with a crew experiencing complete safety and an ocean of possibilities before them. I won't spoil the last episode of Dark Matter, but we simply didn't get that. We were left with a crew in peril, and we never learned how they got themselves out of it. Getting down to brass tacks, I'm sure the question you're impatiently waiting for me to answer is Dark Matter as good as Firefly? My unfortunately unsatisfying answer is that it's just different. Firefly, pre-Serenity anyway, was fairly lighthearted with dark moments sprinkled in, and Dark Matter, as the name suggests, is pretty much the inverse of that. There were a lot of things that Firefly did a lot better, but there are a lot of things that Dark Matter excelled at. It's not a bad series by any stretch of the imagination. Its heavy focus on interpersonal relationships, intrapersonal struggles, exploring personal identity are all sort of the things that lead Trekkies to love Deep Space Nine so much, even though the rest of that series, in my opinion, sucked so hard. But unlike DS9, we get great action, lots of suspense, and a pretty richly detailed universe that I think all fans of this series would have liked to spend a lot more time exploring. If you haven't already, I recommend you check it out. Like I said, you can only watch it on the CW's streaming service, which is so bad, but it's completely free and doesn't even require you to create an account with them. So at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to complain about it being hard to find. I am curious if you've watched Dark Matter and who your favorite character was. I'm obviously biased towards Android myself. I'm curious if the opinions that I have voiced in this video mesh with your own thoughts or whether you came to completely different conclusions. Let me know in the comments. With all that out of the way, I'm about out of things to say, so until next time, stay safe, and I hope to see you here next time at Gray Galaxies.